We'll read from 7. We'll read to the end of the chapter. I'll remind us and give us some context, and then we'll break down our verses for this evening. So, verse 7. The Lord said to Joshua, "This day I will begin to exalt you in the sight of all Israel, that they might know that I am with you as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. So you shall command the priests who bear the ark of the covenant, saying, when you have come to the edge of the water of the Jordan, you shall stand in the Jordan." So Joshua said to the children of Israel, "Come here and hear the words of the Lord your God." Joshua said, "By this you shall know that the living God is among you, that he will without fail drive out from before you the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Hivites, the Perizzites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Jebusites, and any other kind of ites, like termites or anything that might come against you." Verse 11, "Behold," remember the Ark of the Covenant, right? "Behold, the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord." It's now on tour, if you will. Wherever they're going, the Ark of the Covenant is going with them. The whole tabernacle, which is where they worshiped in the wilderness, all that time is packed up and in their midst. And all the contents of the Ark of the Covenant is with them now, as they're now encamped at the side of the river Jordan, opposite Jericho, on the east side of the Jordan, waiting to cross over. Verse 11, "Behold, the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord of all the earth, the Lord of all the earth, is crossing over before you into the Jordan. Now, therefore, take for yourselves 12 men from the tribes of Israel, one man from every tribe. And it shall come to pass, as soon as the soles of the feet of the priests who bear the ark of the Lord of all the earth, shall rest in the waters of the Jordan, that the waters of the Jordan shall be cut off, and the waters that come down from upstream, and they shall stand as a heap," similar to what we've studied and read in Exodus of the Red Sea, right? Verse 14, "And so it was when the people set out from their camp to cross over the Jordan with the priests bearing the Ark of the Covenant before the people, and as those who bore the ark came to the Jordan, and the feet of the priests who bore the ark dipped into the edge of the water. For the Jordan overflows all its banks during the whole time of harvest." You remember me explaining to you that the River Jordan, if you were to be there today, as we were recently, right, Mary Sue? Right, you guys? Mr. and Mrs. Marvella? The newly deads? It wasn't much to look at. Really wasn't. I mean, you could throw a rock across with just kind of an underhanded toss. I mean, it's not. But what he's saying here is that most of the time, during a certain season, the river swells to a very overwhelming size and depth. So it changes. It's not the same all the time. And so he's saying that here. And in verse 16, that the waters which came down from upstream stood still and rose in a heap very far away there was a city called Adam. You can look that up in your maps. If you look at the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, it's a little bit below the halfway point is where Adam would have been. And that was beside a place called Zaratan, which is to the west of where Adam was, closer to the Mediterranean Sea. So the waters that went down to the Sea of the Arabah and the Sea of the Salt Sea, or the Dead Sea, they failed. The River Jordan failed, and they were cut off, and the people crossed over opposite Jericho. Then the priests who bore the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stood firm on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan, and all the priests crossed over on dry ground, and all Israel, crossed over on dry ground until all the people had crossed completely over the Jordan. So again now, amen. So I just want to really encourage you to think about the meaning of the Promised Land. Let's do a brief comparison between, because you've probably heard it in some popular hymns. There are people who have looked at the Promised Land and said, well, that's a type of heaven, right? And I think I thought that way for years in my adolescence, and I just imagined that. I guess it's probably because of the songs. But in fact, that's a horrible representation of heaven if you think about it. Why? Because once they finally came into the land, they weren't sinlessly perfect. They hadn't been freed from their body of sin and temptation. The enemy still has the ability to attack them in the Promised Land, right? None of those things sound like heaven to me. So for me, the promised land, I look at the life of a Christian and I see, well, what's the difference between the time they were broken out of the land of Egypt as slaves and the desert? Okay, so there's a difference to me. There I see salvation. I see they're broken free from the bondage and corruption that they were in to now a freedom. Now, it wasn't easy. At first, it was tough. Desert wandering, right? And what's interesting to me, too, is that they didn't have to spend, this is now 40 years since that. Do you realize that? This is 40 years after they got freed from Egypt. But it didn't have to be. It didn't have to be 40 years. They had approached the promised land once before and sent 12 spies out, and 10 of them came back with a report that said, man, it's just we can't do it. The people in the land, they're just too many, they're too big, it's just too hard, we'll perish. And 2 of them, Joshua, this same guy right here, and Caleb, said, you know what, that's all true, but God said it's ours, let's go do this. But the people, the elders, and they all basically said, well, no, we're going to take the advice of the 10 guys, and they didn't go in. And because of unbelief, they had to wait 40 years. Literally, if you go back and read it, everyone who was either 20 years old or older could not enter in because of unbelief. They were held accountable. So literally, it establishes sort of this doctrine of an age or a point of maturity where you become accountable for your faith. See that? It's interesting. So everyone of 20 years old or older had to pass on before the nation could once again. And Joshua was then called by God and anointed. And now right here in this passage we just kind of read back from last week in verse 7, God's elevating him, not for the purpose of people admiring Joshua, that their faith would be in Joshua. That is not the reason God elevates anyone. God elevates people so that people would have a clear view as to how God is leading them or where God is leading them. So Joshua, as a leader, had to bring the people in the will of God. He had to be dependent on God to bring them in the will of God. Joshua is the person that God gives the instructions to and imparts vision through. Joshua imparts that vision, says, this is what we're going to do, and then that they set out to do it. That's a picture of the church. Now, leading them through the wilderness, right, is a process of sanctification that never ends. But it's not until they're in the promised land that things begin to change for them as a people. That is, that they begin to have an identity and a purpose, and where they can start to plant crops and bear fruit, right? And they can start to make a difference in the world for the kingdom eternal kingdom of God, right? An eternal purpose place. So for me, the promised land is the difference in the life of a Christian after they get saved, and I see people stay in this state for far too long. And folks, let me tell you something. You might figure out tonight as we talk about this, that's where you're at. You're not in your land yet. Let me encourage you that you should not be content in your Christianity until you find yourself in that place of worship and fruit-bearing, where you have a place where you're plugged into the kingdom, where you're serving and worshiping and ministering to others as you're being ministered to. So the wilderness is a place of preparation for the promised land. It's a place of building character. And what do we used to say when we taught through Exodus? God went through all the trouble in the first 15 chapters of getting Israel out of Egypt. And then for the next 40 years, went through a process of getting Egypt out of the people, out of Israel. So we come out of the world, because Egypt is a type of the world. We're saved from the world. And there's a process where God begins to get a lot of the world out of us, right? Too much faith in the world, too much longing for the ways and the things of the world. And that stuff has to break. And I find that it's interesting, too, because as people draw closer, they see others who are dwelling in their promised land. They have purpose, they have ministry. They're working and serving. They have a vision for it. They have a passion for it. They see those others, and they often strive and try to be that. But they're not dealing with the worldliness that God's trying to get out of them. So one of the things that holds people back from entering into that promised land. One of the things that holds them back from that is worldliness. There's still too much Egypt in them. And so, it's that process. Are they saved? Absolutely. Like the thief on the cross. Did he ever enter his earthly promised land in this sense? No. Today you'll be with me in paradise. He hung there on the cross. He died there on the cross. One moment of faith converted him and saved him. That's all it takes. I don't want you to make any mistakes. You don't work for salvation. I heard in one of your prayers, Lord, forgive me. Now, God has already forgiven you. If you sin tomorrow and you turn around and confess that sin, you don't need to be forgiven for it. You need to be cleansed from it. So once you're saved, it's a process of maintaining a cleansed conscience and a clear conscience. It's maintaining your faith by confessing sin. Because what did it say in 1 John? If you confess your sin, he is faithful and just to forgive you your sin if you're not saved, and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness if you are. And so I know you feel bad, you want to say sorry, and that's good. I do it too. I still do it anyway. But he's literally cleansing me from my filth and from my sin. His blood has forgiven me. Anyway, so we're back in verse 11 now, and they're camped there 3 days while 2 spies went in. You remember the 2 spies that went in? It was weeks ago that we last studied this passage. The 2 spies went into Jericho, and they met up with Rahab, and they made a deal. Remember the scarlet thread that was to hang out, or the scarlet piece of cloth that was to hang out her window, and that the promise was that all her household, anyone that would be inside of her room when the Israelites came in, that they would be saved, because a deal was made with her. And she housed and hid the 2 spies. Her act of faith saved her life, saved by grace through faith. And then later on, you'll find her in the genealogy of Jesus Christ. Can you imagine a harlot in the genealogy of Jesus Christ and the grace of God? Does God have any respect for sins that have been confessed and repented of? No, they're done. As far as the east is from the west. In other words, listen, I don't care about your past. God has a purpose, a promised land, a meaning for your life. And don't limit in your mind what you think God is able to do with you. It's not for you to do. You think Rahab had any idea the significance of her life in the moment she made the deal with the spies? I don't think she had any idea. She just knew that God, the God of the Israelites, is a real God, and the God of the people dwelling in the city of Jericho, not so much. Whoever they worshipped at the time, I don't remember off the top of my head. So they're at the side of Jordan, opposite Jericho. They're ready now to cross over, and they've been camped there 3 days. The spies have returned. And Joshua is now disseminating the instructions that God has given. And if you remember again in verse 10, he says, by this you shall know. Again, that word know there means that you can sort of be somewhat certain. No. It means that you can be absolutely sure. There has to be a sense of certainty and absolute faith in the fact that God is with you, right? And so how does Joshua manifest that? By this you shall know that the living God is among you, that he without fail will drive out from before you the Canaanites, the Hittites, and so on and so forth, everyone who dwelt in the land. And so we need to know that wherever God leads us, he goes before us. Not only does he go before us, but he's prepared it beforehand, right? We're his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus beforehand, that we should walk in his works that he's prepared for us. Everywhere we set our foot to go that he has purpose for us, he's already there waiting. And the inhabitants that are there, at times you look at the history of Israel, there's bloodshed sometimes. Now, I don't mean literal bloodshed. These are all metaphors, right? They're all types. And so for us, when we finally arrive in that promised land, it's not like, okay, I'm done. I can kick my feet up and throw my hands behind my head and chill. It's not like that. Sometimes the battles get harder. Right, Tom? Sometimes the battles get harder. Why? Because the enemy doesn't want us there. Why? Because now we're going to start manifesting fruit in the body of Christ. And that's going to then draw more people into the body of Christ. So when we arrive at that place of worship and service and ministry and all those things, and we begin to bear fruit, sometimes the battles really start then. And we're like, what happened? I thought I was serving God. And you're like, no, this is exactly the plan. But it is God who goes before you, and that's why, we have these symbols in our mind that have meaning. They were physical symbols then, they're spiritual today. The Ark of the Covenant, it's not a physical thing for us, right? For us, the Ark of the Covenant, who in this story is Jesus? It's the Ark of the Covenant, it's not Joshua. So Joshua didn't save them from their sins. Jesus, the presence of God, is the power and the leadership. And so anyway, behold, the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord of all the earth. By the way, I like how he says the Lord of all the earth there, right? Is crossing over before you. God is going before you. Jesus goes before you into the Jordan. Now, therefore, take for yourselves 12 men of the tribes of Israel, 1 man from every tribe, and it shall come to pass as soon as the soles of the feet of the priests who bear the ark of the Lord of all the earth, shall rest in the waters of the Jordan, that the waters of the Jordan shall be cut off, the waters that come down from upstream, and they shall stand up as a heap. Now, there have been many people who have said, well, what happened here was a very natural occurrence, that it was an earthquake. It was, they'll say it was, most people say an earthquake, but to me, okay, so what? So you mean to tell me that exactly at that moment that it was, they're crossing the Jordan and they've all lined up and they're ready to cross in the ark, and now here come the priests with the ark and they set their feet into the water. Well, accidentally, just all of a sudden an earthquake happens by random chance? I could care less whether it was an earthquake. I could care less whether, God, his personal hand, stopped the waters. It doesn't matter how. The timing is miraculous. Everything about it is miraculous. The point is that God stopped the waters of the Jordan at the moment the priests set their feet in the water. The priests needed to exercise faith in stepping into the water, right? So here they're carrying the Ark of the Covenant. They have to walk out into water. How do we usually behave when it comes to steps of faith? We usually wait for the river to dry up before we're willing to walk. Let's be honest. Maybe God has laid out some vision for you, and the promised land lies on the other side of a river, and you're thinking to yourself about all that you have to deal with in order to get over there, when literally it's God that wants to do the work. You just have to follow. I think we place too much emphasis on our own ability, our own sense of self. It gets in the way of us following God and bearing fruit and dwelling in the promised land. Amen? And so, God says, listen, send the priests. Why the priests? Well, because who gets the credit? Who gets the credit for the miracle? If he would have sent out the army first, which to me, from a human point of view, I'm sending, my number one unit out front. Why? Because on the other side is the Amalekites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites. I want to protect all the people. I mean, the priests aren't going to do much. They're carrying a big, heavy golden box. How are they going to fight? So the priests, do we remember in our minds now what a priest does? A priest represents God to the people, and a priest represents the people to God. A priest is no one of himself. He's not there for any glory. He's not there to receive worship from people. He should reject worship. He's not there to be admired. He's not there to be put on a pedestal. He's there to represent the people to God and God to the people. That's the job of a priest. And so when the priest goes out and he's the one leading, it's saying that the human instrument that God set between God and them, there he is, the servant of God, the servant of God. It's not about their physical prowess. It's not about the size of their swords. They walk out in the water. They set their feet in the water. The presence of God and the Ark of the Covenant is with them. Boom. What happens? God stops the water. The object of our stumbling is removed when we walk by faith and not by sight. You have to step into the water. Like, just think about Peter in that moment when they were crossing Galilee, you know. I thought about this a lot when we were out there on the boat on the Sea of Galilee. They're on this boat, probably about a 20-foot boat, something like that. We saw one similar to one they probably were on. They had found one that was from around the first century that was buried in the mud. And we saw what it would have looked like. We saw a model of it. I'm thinking, here comes Jesus walking on the Sea of Galilee in the middle of a storm, you know. And good old Peter, you know, always putting his foot in his mouth. Bid that I come to you, Lord. Okay, whatever, Peter. Come on, let's go, you know. Bring it on, bro. Well, hey, I give Peter a lot of credit. He stepped. And he might have got a couple steps in before he started looking around and thinking about himself too much. But you have to walk before you can see the object of your faith move, right? Before you can see the miracle happen, you have to walk. And if you want to cross that next step in your life and come to that place where you find meaning and fulfillment connected with God in terms of your whole life, everything revolves around that. Let's talk a little bit about what that looks like. So think about people in your mind that you know that are Christians. There are those who go to church. They go maybe pretty regularly, but that's it, really. They listen to some radio programs or whatever. They listen to a message here and there. But there's really no fruit. They're just kind of wandering about. They probably have some secret things that they're not really dealing with, or maybe they're just not. They don't have a vision for anything more. Then you think about the people who are actively involved in things, whether it's in the church or in a parachurch ministry organization, and they're serving and they're giving part of their life to God. Think about the mindset of the two different groups of people. Which would you rather be? To me, that's the difference between the promised land and the wilderness wandering. I'd rather be the people who everything in their life has a purpose that's connected to eternity. I'd rather be the person who maybe I'm working a job, maybe it's it's a 9-to-5er, and I work hard, but I don't work hard for the sake of the job. I work hard because the Lord tells me give my employer an honest, hard-working day because he's my employer, and I should do that. It just says that in 1 Timothy. Instruct the people in the church if they have a master to work hard, period. Because you're doing it unto the Lord. Doesn't matter whether they're a Christian or not. And if they're a Christian, don't expect them to go easy on you. Work even harder, or work just as hard for them. 1 Timothy chapter 6. So to me, again, work is not what I live for, right? Work is a means to facilitate my life so I can invest in the kingdom of God. We have to begin to see that. That's the difference between those who live in the promised land, who are bearing fruit in the kingdom, who are, knocking on the doors of the churches, and I want to just give me something to do. I want to serve the Lord. I want something I can touch that's God's. I remember there was a moment in my life, I hadn't been walking with the Lord very well for those years. I was in the surf, skate, and snowboard industry, and I was just thinking about this today, actually, and I hadn't been going to church, and I finally found a church, and I'm back in church, and I'm just getting fed, and I'm getting fed and fed and fed, and I'm just getting excited about God again. My life's getting back on track, and one day, and I was only there for maybe 3-4 months, and just getting to know people, and I was at anything going on. If there was something going on in church, I was there. One day, on a Sunday morning, one of the guys, this guy, I think it was Tony, came up to me and said, "Hey, would you want to help with some of the stuff?" I looked at him, I said, "You mean I can do something?" "Well, yeah, I mean, we need help making these cassette tapes and putting the stickers on them, writing the labels out, putting the stickers on them because people want copies of the message." Cassette tapes, right? You didn't pick up on that. You would have laughed without me saying anything, but you didn't pick up on that. And so it so shook me that I was being offered to help. It was a moment, I literally started to weep because all of a sudden I realized in that moment that God could use me, that I could be part of the ministry of a church. It blew me away. I thought that I had blown that. I thought that my life had pretty much canceled that out as a possibility. A lot of different things went into that conception. Every pastor I'd ever known, up until that point, really never talked much about their own struggles and sin. They really just spoke a lot of Christian stuff and taught a lot of Bible messages, but never really talked about their personal struggles before. So for me, I couldn't relate to someone who was in the church serving and working for the Lord, because they were to me, they were perfect, and they don't sin. They must not, because they never talk about it. That's why I think it's good that we talk about ourselves and the fact that we're sinners too, And so in that moment, it just all came crashing down. And from that moment forward, I haven't stopped serving the Lord. That was the moment I started serving the Lord. I haven't stopped since. Why? Because that's the area of the greatest fulfillment in my life. There's nothing more satisfying in my life than serving God. I always need to know what I'm doing in serving the Lord. I need a vision for everything I do, whether it's working a job, doesn't matter what it is, it has to be connected to facilitating a lifestyle of serving God. Everything. Recently, Zoe was awarded an award through her school. The Rotary Club here in town started a short while ago trying to find ways of connecting with the youth, because they're trying to stay young, connecting with the young people in the community to encourage them to service type thinking, to serving others, right? The Rotarian model, I think their motto is others above self or something like that. So they created this award that they decided they're going to hand this out every year, an annual thing. It's called the Others Above Self Award or something along those lines. And they reach out to the local school administration, the principals and such, in the various schools in their zip code, to try to find an exceptional student. So this year, somehow, it's usually a high school student. Last year was a high school student. Somehow, Principal O'Hara from the school here, from Zoe's school, the middle school, Zoe's a 7th grader, got wind of one of Zoe's teachers talking about all the missions work that Zoe had done in Ireland and helping the kids, these underprivileged kids from other countries, and helping them learn how to surf and learn about the Bible. And then how she did some serving in the women's ministry and taught a dance to some other girls and took a step back, and instead of having herself out front, let them all have it. And then, all these other little things. The teacher was so impressed that the principal got wind of it. The principal then told the Rotarians, hey, this is the kid I'm suggesting. And they decided to give Zoe the honor. Now, I'm not telling you this so you'd be impressed with Zoe. I'm telling you this because she's being taught, and I realized that in that moment, we are teaching our daughter a life of serving others as a means of introducing them to the Lord. So that is the mindset of the person who's standing east of the Jordan, looking across to the west and desiring to be there. The other mindset is standing somewhere in the east of the Jordan, looking back at Egypt and getting confused as to which you want more. Worldliness, Egypt, or the Promised Land. And whether or not you're ready to let go of all that world stuff, And don't get me wrong, please. God gives us all things to freely enjoy. So there's still a lot of the world that we have fun with. We just don't worship it. And if it's hindering our Promised Land experience and our goals and vision for the Promised Land, if it's a hindrance to that, it needs to go, right? And so, verse 14, so it was when the people set out from their camp to cross over to the Jordan. Think about their excitement. 40 years of waiting for this promise. And by the way, a quick little side note. On my 40th birthday, without knowing that it was my 40th birthday, my pastor ordained me. Isn't that weird? It's pretty cool. My 40th birthday, it was literally on the day of my 40th birthday, my pastor ordained me, brought me up on stage in front of the church with some of the elders, laid hands on me. This is out in California, and ordained me. And it was mind-boggling to me, because in that moment, everything changed for me. Literally it was different. Not because he laid hands on me and ordained me, because it was like a sobering moment that God said, this is it. this is a life-defining moment. They were just agreeing with what they saw God was doing. That's all they were doing. They made that very clear. So, all the people of the camp, get up, get over to the Jordan with the priests bearing the ark of the covenant before the people. Now, verse 15, and as those who bore the ark came to the Jordan, and the feet of the priests who bore the ark dipped in the edge of the water. Again, why is this significant? Well, it overflows its banks during the whole time of the harvest. So imagine, it's one thing to get a small group of people, even an army of military men, across a river. And now, even just a small river, imagine it's at its normal, I got to remember where I left off here. Imagine that it's at its normal height, and it's not swelled. So, getting a few people over is no big deal. Getting even an army of military men is not that big of a deal. But you're getting carts, animals, kids, old people, millions of people across the Jordan. Do you understand? This is a big deal. This is a couple million plus people having to cross this riverbed. And again, it now adds to that it's swelled. So the priests go out, they set their foot in it. Verse 16, that the waters which come down from upstream. Now upstream, the Jordan comes from Mount Hermon, and there's 3 rivers that combine together up around Mount Hermon to come together and form the River Jordan. And it comes into the Sea of Galilee, and then at the southern end of the Sea of Galilee, it flows out of the Sea of Galilee and continues downward in elevation all the way down to the Dead Sea. So somewhere between Galilee, the Sea of Galilee, and where they're at, around the city of Adam, God stops the water. Upstream, stood still, rose up in a heap very far away at Adam, right? The waters failed and were cut off, and the people crossed over. And it says exactly where they crossed over, opposite Jericho. Think about the significance of this place, right? This is the place where, very near or right around there, Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist. Very symbolic place of life-changing events. In that moment, did Jesus need to be baptized? And not in terms of setting an example for us, because that's, he showed us what to do in doing that. But did he personally need a baptism? No. He lived in sinless perfection. There was no past life to be cleansed from symbolically. There was no identification of that. But what's interesting is it was before the cross, wasn't it? So he wasn't identifying, looking backward at his Messiah who died on the cross, was buried, and rose again. But he was identifying with the people in their need to be saved from their sin in that moment. And that was the place he did it. The place where the nation Israel crossed over into the promised land. Beautiful picture. And so it was when the people set out, they came to the River Jordan, they let the priests go forward, the priests put their feet in the water stopped up. Let's continue now. The waters which did come down from upstream stood still, rose up in a heap, up by Adam and the city Zaratan. So the waters that went down into the sea of Arabah, that sea of the Arabah, that's actually south, I think, of the Dead Sea. Here it's the Dead Sea is the Salt Sea, it says here. Those waters failed, and they were cut off, and the people crossed over opposite Jericho. Then the priests who bore the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stood firm on dry ground. So in my mind, I'm thinking, it's going to be pretty muddy. It's been soaking wet underwater. But not only did the Lord stop the water, but he dried the ground. He made it so that it was easier to get everybody across on drier ground, right? And as we're going to see next week, he wanted them to never forget this. And so next week, he's going to have one man from each of the 12 tribes. You saw him call them out in this passage already. They're each going to, as they cross over, they're going to pick up on their shoulder. So we're not talking about a pebble here. They're going to pick up on their shoulder, each pick up a boulder from the center, from the middle of the Jordan River, carry it out to the other side, and those stones will be then stacked in the place where they camp so that they can look back on those 12 stones and think about so much about that experience and the importance of it and never forget it. And every time their kids see it, they can tell that story. So, the priests who bore the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord stood firm on dry ground in the midst of the Jordan. And listen, all Israel. So you remember some of the tribes had arrived at their promised land east of the Jordan. When they were told, the divisions of the land were given, I think it was Zebulun and I forget the tribes, was it Naphtali? I forget who it was. 2.5 tribes were given land east of the Jordan to be their promised land. And they were already there in a sense. They were at their promised land. But Joshua said, listen, guys, you can't stop here. Y'all have to come over Jordan with the rest of Israel. Once we've all entered the promised land, then you guys can go back and re-enter your promised land. So I want to know how they cross back over. That's what's interesting to me. We don't know about that, but they eventually do. So Israel crossed over on dry ground until all the people had crossed completely over the Jordan. So again, once you get over to the promised land, you're like wide-eyed little kids in a place you've never looked on before. Now all of a sudden you've crossed over and everything is possible, but nothing is without difficulty. They're opposite Jericho on the west side in the promised land. They're in the land itself, across the Jordan. But they know at the same time that it's not going to be easy. But because the Lord brought them that far, they know that anything that God desires for them is possible. And so, you start from a place of uncertainty. You're wide-eyed and scared. Oh my gosh, look at what lies before me. I'm scared, Lord. And that's a good place to be, is honest. But you look at it all and you say to yourself, Jericho's a walled city. How are we gonna conquer these people? Eventually we'll get to that, right, in the book of Joshua, where the most unthinkable method of defeating an army. Okay, guys, I want you to walk around the walls. You want me to what? Walk around the walls? Yeah, just walk around the walls, once a day for 7 days, and then was it seven times more, or a total of 7 times on the 7th day or something like that? Just walk around and blow the trumpets. You're gonna what? That's how we're gonna defeat? Yeah, that's it. Why? So that you can take no credit for what I've done. So that fear, the fear of me, will continue. You see, when the spies went into Jericho before they crossed over, Rahab knew, she feared the God of the Jews. And listen, if you want to avail yourself in this world of the protection of the fear of God, because people know God's with you, you have to learn to wait for Him to do things His way. You can't make things happen on your own. Oh, no, Lord, I got this one. Don't worry about it. You could take a day off, Lord. I got that. No. Cross over the Jordan, fine. But let the Lord lead in everything else after. Amen?